Let's now turn our attention back to our new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, having appointed his cabinet and launched a number of policies. He went to Scotland to attend the Commonwealth Games. He also opened up his number 10 of the North. But look, what we want to do is we had a huge focus on Manchester. This week feels like a lot of it has been about Manchester, which we get. We've got this new number 10 of the North. But what we wanted to do is do a bit of a bounce round the rest of the country to see how the new Prime Minister is going down in different parts of the world. So we've got John Boothman we're going to speak to in a moment, who's our Scottish political correspondent at the Times and the Sunday Times. We've got Cathy Owens, who is a political advisor, an expert and consultant. She's going to join us from Cardiff. And we've got Amanda Ferguson, who's going to join us from Belfast. She's a journalist and broadcaster. John, I'm going to come to you first. Let's talk about how Andy Burnham has been going down in Scotland, because it's fair to say there's been a bit of a, as we would say, a stushy.
Look, there's some things we're saying, Ayesha, about domestic policy first. Miata Fambula was in Aberdeen. They're signalling changes to oil and gas that will be very welcome in that part of the world, despite the fires that have set the Highlands aflames. So there's an interesting thing there. He met John Swinney. He's ruled out independence. Both governments are talking about devolution, but, the Scottish government's idea of devolution, more powers to it, is different from Andy Burnham's. But look, one of the things that's been dominating the news in Scotland this week is the impact of changes in the Labour Party in Scotland. They had a disastrous election. Andy Burnham was seen as a breath of fresh air, replacing Starmer, who had such a bad reputation in Scotland anyway. And there's a civil war breaking out in the Labour Party in Scotland about who succeeds Anas Sarwar as the leader. People are really angry in the Labour Party, and I think there's a bit of this in the electorate, that Anas Sarwar's gone off to Westminster to take a job in the House of Lords as a government minister. And I think we're going to see a couple of months now of fighting in the Labour Party as to who the next leader's going to be, when Andy Burnham would have been hoping for a bit of a honeymoon period.
And just explain why people are so cross about Anas Sarwar going off to the House of Lords.
I think they're cross because he said, for example, that this is something that he wouldn't do. I don't think the look of it is very good with the public. If you've said that, trust in politicians, as we keep talking about, isn't great. It just looks like somebody who is being, as some of his colleagues have said, utterly selfish and doing a bit of a feathering of his own nest. It just hasn't gone down well at all.
And there was always this accusation, which was very damaging to the Labour Party in Scotland, John, wasn't there? It was at one point by an outgoing Scottish Labour Party leader, Joanne Lamont, that the Labour Party in Scotland was a branch office of Westminster. Do you think that is something that is likely to sort of, come up in terms of what's happening with Labour in Scotland and all of these sort of movements?
It plays into all of that. It plays into all of these ideas that Labour doesn't run itself, that Westminster is more important than the Scottish Parliament. It looks like Anas is deserting Holyrood, as I said, to go to Westminster, when, it's just not where people are at.
OK. Well, look, stay on the line, John. We may come back to you. Let's now head to Wales and speak to Cathy Owens. Cathy, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us. So tell us, how has Andy Burnham's new government gone down in Wales? There has been a new Secretary of State for Wales, Stephen Kinnock, obviously a household name in Wales in terms of the Kinnock dynasty. What's the mood like in Wales, particularly because there is a new Welsh government? Labour's not in charge anymore, it's Plaid Cymru.
I think a lot of people in Welsh Labour will be thinking this is about 3 months too late. And I think it's to do with the timing. It's really challenging timing because, of course, everything that Andy Burnham talks about is something that Welsh Labour has been doing much of the last 25 years without anybody knowing about it. I've been talking about the fact that Manchesterism, there's a lot of resonance in terms of Welsh Labour, much stronger relationships from local authorities, more of a status response, more interventionist, no competition in public services, all of those things, Welsh Labour has instigated effectively over the last 25 years in government. So whilst a lot of Welsh voters will absolutely recognise and will be pleased with what Andy Burnham is doing, it is too late for Welsh Labour in a sense. So effectively, strategically, whilst it's a good thing for Welsh Labour, it's too late. So at the moment, tactically, we're seeing Labour and Plaid Cymru switching sides from opposition to government, and both of them are sort of finding their way through about how to do that. Plaid Cymru are finding it difficult not to be acting like an opposition party. It's really quite interesting at the moment in terms of they failed to pass a part of their budget. So we've got lots of tactical things going on the ground. The big picture, I think, is that a lot of people would be quite happy with what he's doing and saying, and it's something that we've been talking about here for many years.
And Reen ap Iorwerth has put a statement out saying that he demands parity with Scotland via a new Wales bill. He wants devolution of policing and justice. And he said that he wants a replacement of the Barnett formula. How has Downing Street responded to that? And what do you think, the new First Minister's relationship will be like with Andy Burnham?
I think they'll have a positive and constructive relationship. That's certainly better than Keir Starmer. I'm not even sure Keir Starmer met Reen at any point over the last 10 weeks. So much more positive and constructive relationship, because clearly Andy Burnham is looking for a more constructive working relationship with all levels of government all across the UK. Now, I think the question is, do we expect to get the same level of devolution in every part of the UK all at the same time? I'm not sure we do. So I think you've got to look at Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland differently. You've got, the metro mayors in some parts of the UK, not in others. We don't have them in Wales, but we have unitary authorities in a way that others don't. But I think so I don't think we're going to be making a huge amount of progress on some of the things that Plaid Cymru will be asking for. However, we already have here quite a lot of joint working, consensual work with local authorities. And I think where Andy Burnham might be able to enhance some of that, for example, is around the cost of living and allowing the Welsh Government to work with local authorities even more on things like economic development, regional development, shared prosperity funds, those sorts of things.
Okay.
But where you can really enhance the economy or bring down waiting lists, enhance public services, rather than just the sake of it providing more powers. It's more powers for a reason, then there's going to be a real discussion about it.
And of course, there is also a lot devolved already in Wales, like, health is devolved as it is in Scotland as well. We'll stay on the line, Cathy. We may come back to you. Let's now turn our attention to Amanda Ferguson, who is in Belfast. Amanda is a journalist and broadcaster. Amanda, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good.
So tell us, what do we think how do people in Northern Ireland feel about Andy Burnham's appointment, and what are some of the pressing issues that Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengallen will want to be pushing him on?
Well, that's a very simple question for a very complicated region of the UK, which is probably why you came to me last. In all honesty, the way that the voters break down in Northern Ireland, it's kind of 40-40-20. 40% of voters don't want the British government to be involved in affairs in Northern Ireland. 40% want desperately to remain part of the UK, and the other 20% we're not really sure about. So Sinn Féin won't be happy to hear about the no referendums issue, whereas the DUP will perhaps be a bit more buoyed by that. But to be honest with you, Irish Republicans don't really care who is in charge or who the team is at Westminster, because they don't want them involved at all, whereas the DUP will be wanting Andy Burnham to prove his unionist credentials And also unionists are very mistrusting of Westminster because they're always waiting to be betrayed by them. I think whenever it comes down to Andy Burnham as an individual, I think a lot of people see him as quite a normal person who has a sort of authenticity, can't really fake. And I'm sure that that's something that has become apparent on social media and elsewhere. He did engage with the Deputy First Minister, Emma Little-Pengelly, at the Commonwealth Games in Scotland, but he hasn't made a visit yet to Northern Ireland. The only other time I can really think of that Andy Burnham's been over here was in March. He was a guest speaker at the Alliance Party conference, and Alliance is kind of a cross-community party that draws support from Republicans and Unionists. So the idea that Plaid Cymru and the SNP and Sinn Féin are at the top of the leadership of all the devolved nations provides a bit of headache. And the one thing in Northern Ireland that you can find agreement on is that they all want more money from Westminster.
Oh, well, I think there's a lot of agreement on that. Well, look, stay on the line, all three of you. We're just going to have a short break and then we're going to come back to you because we've got quite a few questions coming in. We're doing a bit of a UK bounce round. We've got brilliant journalists and experts in Scotland, Cardiff and Belfast. John is in Edinburgh. We've got John Boothman, who's in Edinburgh. We've got Cathy Owens, who's in Cardiff. We've got Amanda Ferguson, who is in Belfast. John, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, Labour in Scotland has had a very, very difficult time. It's just lost another election. The SNP is continuing its dominance. Just talk to us about the independence question, and John Swinney obviously raised it. Is this something that they will sort of pursue with Andy Burnham, and will they make an argument saying, listen, you're the one that talks about devolution, this is the ultimate devolution?
Yeah, look, they've made this argument. They continue to make this argument. It's worth saying that it was the worst result for Labour in the 7 elections since devolution, so that's a pretty bad position for Labour to be in. But the SNP, look, they're raising DETRA as independence. They say that there's an independence majority in the Parliament, and there is when combined with the Greens, and they'll continue to proselytise the case for that. Andy Burnham really has dismissed that, saying it's completely off limits. And I think, that argument really isn't going very far. I think what is more interesting is the whole argument about devolution. The SNP see that as being devolution to the Scottish Government, to the which Labour would argue has over-centralised since devolution powers to itself. Andy Burnham's idea is something more at a regional level. We don't have mayors in Scotland. We don't have the sort of multi-purpose authorities like Greater Manchester. Burnham would like to see those kind of developments, I think, in Scotland, but he said he won't override the Scottish Government to introduce these. So I think that's where that whole constitutional argument sits.
Okay, yes, and I've often heard the argument that actually people in the islands and highlands in Scotland feel that Holyrood is as remote in terms of Westminster, so that is an interesting argument. Amanda, quite a few questions are coming in about Northern Ireland. I've got a couple to put to you. If you could just be brief with your answers so we can get through as many as possible. People are saying, a lot of people are very sad to see Hilary Benn leave his post. What's the thinking on that? How's that gone down in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, he got a good sort of send off, and there was a reasonably warm welcome for Chris Bryant. I think people were surprised that he had taken the job, and you couldn't give me all of the tea in China to be the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, because it is a thankless task, because you have such difficult competing interests between Republicans, Unionists and others. And I think one of the big things that he'll have to tackle will be getting a budget set for Northern Ireland, because we're into Q2 of the financial year and there's still no budget, and we also have an election next year, and we also have to deal with the aftermath of the legacy legislation, which the British and Irish governments have to work out between them.
And a few people have messaged in, and this is an interesting question, because people are very interested about Andy Burnham's faith, because he's very proud Catholic, and people are just asking, will that have any bearing on politics in Northern Ireland at all?
Well, Andy Burnham is a Labour Prime Minister, and Labour has a historic relationship with the Social Democratic and Labour Party in Northern Ireland, the SDLP, which is an Irish nationalist party. I think a lot of eyebrows were raised whenever people found out that Andy Burnham won't be able to hand the list to the King about Church of England appointments because he's a Catholic, and they were kind of laughing at that. But no, I don't think, the issue in Northern Ireland isn't really about religion as such. It's about whether you have a British or Irish identity or some mixture of all of those things.
And a couple of follow-up questions from that are, given that Andy Burnham is very pro-devolution, do you think at some point he might be pro-Irish reunification? Do you think that'll be an issue that will sort of come, will be put to him?
It'll be put to him all the time, but it's something that he and Chris Bryant have been quite clear to say it's not on their priority list. They're not, being ruling it out, but there was some criticism of Chris Bryant online from a Unionist party leader saying that he was an EU fanatic, and there were concerns that that Andy Burnham might be too sympathetic to Irish nationalists in Northern Ireland. And Chris Bryant tried to respond, offering reassurance that he wanted to see a strong Northern Ireland and a strong UK and so on. But it'll be a major headache for both Burnham and Bryant. It's not an issue that's going away, particularly post-Brexit.
Well, that's cheery news for them to add to their list of things. Cathy, let's come to you now. Labour had a terrible set of results in Scotland. They had an as equally dismal set of results in Wales. Really shocking results in Wales. I mean, is there a sort of feeling in Wales and a bit of a danger, I suppose, and John was alluding to this as well, that there's great exuberance right now in Westminster, and for those northern Labour MPs that they've got their man in, it's all great, but actually, how do you begin rebuilding a very crushed political force in Wales?
Yeah, it was worse than Scotland. It was an absolute stinker. They lost power for the first time in 100 years. So effectively, the Labour government at a UK level is crafting a more progressive outlook, and that is really what went wrong just before the election. Most progressive voters in Wales, and there is a progressive majority, just decided we're not listening to Keir Starmer anymore, and we've got a perfectly reasonable and safe alternative in Plaid Cymru, and effectively that's what changed over the last 2 years. Now, okay, so Andy Burnham's in a much better position to earn back the trust of progressive voters. That's absolutely true. But we've got 4 years of a minority Plaid Cymru government here, so it sort of doesn't really matter, the short term. What Labour will have to do is to prove that they're a really effective opposition. And actually, and somewhat surprisingly, you might argue, because they've got such a small number, because Plaid are in minority, Labour have got their act together quite quickly in being able to make a strategic intervention around the budget. Plaid Cymru were quite surprised, maybe slightly naive about the fact that they didn't have a majority and therefore couldn't decide exactly how their budget was going to be spent. So we might see something a little bit more over time. In order to ensure there's a stable government, there might be more consensual working with Plaid Cymru.
And how? What about? There was a sizable support for reform, though. It's not entirely fair to say that Wales is just overly progressive. Like, there's quite a lot of people who are quite supportive of reform in Wales as well.
But they are not in government, and I think that's the important point. They are going to be quite a challenging and a noisy opposition, and it's actually been really interesting to watch that team work together and to see how they're going to craft being the chief opposition in Wales. It's quite fascinating. Do they reflect the culture wars continually? Are they focusing on day-to-day issues for their constituencies? It's a really interesting pattern playing out in Wales right now.
OK. Well, look, that was a fascinating conversation, and it's really important. I mean, it has felt that the coverage this week has been very much dominated by what's been happening in SW1 and Westminster and, of course, Manchester. But there are all of these other parts of the country that Andy Burnham and his team are going to have to really think a lot about, because he has to govern for the whole country, not just London and Manchester, of course. My huge thanks to John Boothman, to Cathy Owens and to Amanda Ferguson there.